I'm absolutely excited to be here. It's a tremendous honor to be here. I want to get right into my presentation. As you heard earlier, I've been afforded the opportunity, blessed by God, to go into two churches. I've been pastoring for 23 years, and often I say to God, you have a tremendous sense of humor. Some of the things that God has allowed us to do has been absolutely amazing, and so I think it's a case of often church growth is a case of course, divinity, but sometimes insanity. I started as a sophomore in college as a 19-year-old, and God blessed the ministry immeasurably. It was a younger ministry and about 40 years of age, and so somewhat of an emerging church, and we were able to put some principles in place and really glean from a lot of people that are in this room now, and God blessed the ministry, and it grew to over 3,000 people. And in January of 2004, God moved me from a ministry, over 3,000 people, back to a ministry with 400 members, average age 63.8 in January of 2004. And so we went from what felt like paradise to Ichabod, for lack of a better phrase, and lovely people, wonderful people. And amazingly, Gary McIntosh's book, One Church, Four Generations, I had just led our denominational association meeting on that about 6 months before God moved me to Atlanta, Metro Atlanta. And so be careful what you're reading. You may be preparing for your own ministry. And so we started in 2004. Difficult process because I was following a pastor who had served for 47 years, who was still a part of that ministry, and whose mantra was, "I shall not be moved." And so every Bible study, every choir rehearsal, and so everything that happened in that ministry, I first had to get the approval of him. That's what it seemed. So if I made a statement from the pulpit, you would see every eye look to him, and if he gave his nod of approval, they would approve. And so it was a difficult challenge because attrition was tremendous. It recently built an $8 million building, and it was just a very difficult process. And so this whole piece of transitioning. So how was I to transition being a Joshua with Moses still being there? Can we peacefully coexist when this pastor did not believe in praise and worship, and my style was totally different? And different does not mean that his style was deficient, but you get the point I'm trying to make. And so how do we move this ministry forward? How do we get it into the 21st century? And so there were a few things that we had to do. His wife was a Christian education director. She's still a part of the ministry now. Had been there for almost 40 years. 60 deacons when I arrived. And so you get the picture. Insanity and divinity. And so I began to pray about how can we transition this ministry. And so I put together some things that I think would be helpful to you, because often it's difficult to find practical models. We can read a lot of books, a lot of great theories, but to have a tangible paradigm for how transition can take place was kind of difficult for me to find in my immediate context. And so I want to share with you some things that may be helpful for those of you who are pastoring, and maybe those of you who are a denominational exec, or if you're leading a specific ministry within a ministry. So I want to call this transitioning without imploding. This session is designed to give strategies or best practices for beginning or new leaders in an established church or ministry. It will address how new leaders should relate to previous leadership. It would also seek to empower new leaders to move the ministry forward without alienating those who preceded their specific leadership. And so this is very dear to my heart, and this is true. So this is not just theory. This is from a real place. The first thing I want to say is that we must have a positive attitude. And this is something that God had to really work with me on. I really had to humble myself like never before. To come from a place where we just had everything established, everything is moving rather smoothly. We developed a lot of systems. Everybody understood the process, moving with some sense of upward mobility. And so to come from that, to go to a place where they feel that you are the devil's best friend, makes it difficult. And so one of the things that I noticed, and with a lot of my colleagues who started out in similar contexts, is that a lot of us had the wrong approach initially going in. And so I call this the Messiah complex. Because sometimes when we go into declining ministries, declining churches, we have a tendency to know that it's declining, and we present our ministries as if we're coming to save the day. And in presenting ourselves like little messiahs, what we can end up doing is alienating those who pre-existed us. This is more relevant to those churches that are established versus an emerging church. Emerging churches usually don't have this type of struggle because you lay the paradigm, you lay the foundation, you install the culture, and so you don't have to worry about how we used to do it if you're establishing that ministry. But if you go into a place like I did, 130 years of age, when I went there, that's how old the church was. We're about 140 years of age now. And so very problematic. So I had to understand that I'm not coming in to save the day. I'm not the Messiah. Jesus holds that title and did very well in that position. And so I'm just coming to serve, not be the Messiah. Second thing that I had to really face and appreciate it is that the history of this ministry did not begin with me. So often we go into a place as if we're here to establish everything, that every culture, that every ritual, that every paradigm, that every style of ministry starts with that individual, and that can be problematic. So I had to really familiarize myself with the history of this ministry. What happened? What were some of the things that made it successful in its heyday? What were some of the things that attracted people to the ministry? I'm here to serve, but the history pre-existed me. And so the history didn't start with me, and also the history will not end with me because I'm a part of a relay race. I'm running a leg of the baton. It's been handed to me, and my responsibility was to leave it to someone else better than I found it. And so understanding that I was a part of a greater story that was not all about me, that I had to really love and understand what made this church unique. It gave me some traction and some ability to really relate to the people and for them to accept me. The other thing that helped me was even understanding the Pauline principle of one plants, another waters, but God gives increase. And so coming to the ministry, I understood that a lot of things for this ministry to be successful since May of 1876, 11 years after the conclusion of the Civil War. As a matter of fact, the name of the church came because at that time the Confederate soldiers would have what they call rest homes, rest houses. And once the war ended, the first building that this church was headquartered in was one of those rest houses. And those guys were called travelers in the day. So the name Travelers Rest was attached to that ministry. And so what has made this ministry viable since 1876? What was it when you've seen so many businesses, so much has happened in our nation, so much has happened globally? So what was it that has allowed this ministry to remain vibrant for 137 years? And so my job was to come and to water the things that have been significant and then plant some other things. But ultimately, I recognize that all increase comes from God. Some of the challenges I believe with church growth conferences is that we think that church growth is solely based on how hard we work, how many books we read, how much we pray, how many degrees we have. And I believe that it's important to understand that we can create climates that make church growth more conducive. But ultimately, God is the one who adds the increase. And so I think once we do that, it can take a whole lot of pressure off of ourselves. Because I've seen a lot of people who work harder than I do, who have more degrees than I do, who pray more than I do. When I'm watching football, they're fasting and praying and covered with sackcloth and ashes. And so I think sometimes we think too much of ourselves in terms of being the initiator of church growth. But I sincerely believe that the increase comes from God, but we can create a climate that makes church growth more conducive. And so having the positive attitude, this was difficult for me, leaving a ministry with one deacon and 3,800 members to go to a ministry with 400 people and 60 deacons. To go to a ministry where my predecessor never wore jeans, shirt and tie every time you saw him, where the ladies wore dresses and closed-toe shoes every Sunday. This was the pair. Well, worship was 4.5 hours. Every chant in the hymn book, all things come of thee, incline that, you name it, they mentioned it, all right? And so this was the context. So how do we do this without having a proper attitude, knowing this is my assignment? This was not vocational. This was inspirational. This was the hand of God leading this. And if God is not in that process, the other key thing was me being raised around older people. I have a familiarity and a natural affinity for older people. And so I love old school. I'm an old soul. And so being able to relate with some of the older songs, to not come in and just totally eradicate and eliminate what that generation did. I have an appreciation for it, so it helped me to be adaptable and adjust in that ministry. So going in with the positive attitude, not that I'm going in to tear everything up, but I'm going in to have appreciation. The second point I want to mention is, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, but probing the past approaches. What have they done in the past? And one of the greatest things that you can do, I think, when you're transitioning a church or a specific ministry within a church is to not become an enemy of the past. Not become an enemy of the past. I've seen too many of our colleagues that go into ministries, and even if the predecessor has gone on to be with the Lord, or let's hope that the predecessor went on to be with the Lord, but too many shadow box with someone who's dead. And when you do that, you can use a lot of energy unnecessarily. And so when I went into this ministry, even though my predecessor was different, I did not want to alienate him. I did not want to become his enemy. I wanted to find some sense of commonality and also the ability to celebrate him. This gentleman pastored one church for nearly 50 years. Now, if that's not cause of celebration, nothing else is. And so he served well, and so I did not want to become his enemy. Now, in doing so, I had to be strategic to not allow his milieu or his approach to become my approach. So how did I demarcate between what I felt God was leading me to do in the 21st century without alienating him? So we'd have some difficult conversations, but I always tried to love and shower him with love, and even to this day. And even when he went home to be with the Lord in 2006, we made a decision that his wife would receive half of his pay until the Lord called her home. So to still try to honor and to respect what preceded me, because I don't want to become an enemy of the past. Very, very important. The second thing was to identify the core values that gave the ministry past successes. Kind of alluded to that earlier. One of the things I noticed was that in October of 1957, when my predecessor became the leader of this ministry, his initial approach, along with his wife, was to go into the community in East Atlanta and find young people who were unchurched, to get them in Sunday school, to get them in vacation Bible study, and vacation Bible school. So their initial approach was young people. So a lot of the ministries that they started were centered around young people. Now, when I come into the church in 2004, these young people that they start ministering to, they started a young adult choir in 1960 for the young adults, for the youth. So when I got to this ministry in 2004, the youth choir, the average age was 55. This was a youth choir. And so how could I make these adjustments? And so one of the things that was key was I looked at the core value. The same core value that he had in 1957 was young people. And so looking at McIntosh's book about the builders and the boomers and the busters and the bridgers, and we took the Bible study through each. I spent about 8 weeks on Wednesday nights and took the whole church through McIntosh's book. I outlined the book for them, had them to buy the book. We went through the book. This was in July of 2004. We spent about 8 weeks, chapter by chapter. We purchased the books. I took the leadership through it. We went through it and began to deal with the nuances. Okay, the older people, you like it. You like the same familiar stories. You like the lights dim. You don't want the music too loud. Younger people want the lights. We want the woofers and the twitters. We want to feel the beat, you know. So to deal with all those nuances and then to give them an appreciation for each demographic. And so in doing that, identifying with that core value, I said to them, the way that we reach young people in 1957, we cannot utilize those same approaches in 2004. And so working in that particular area with that approach gave me some sense of connection with them, because now they're younger people, their children who had left the church years ago started to come back to the church, what made them a little more acceptable to some of the things that we were doing. Not totally happy. It's been almost 10 years, and some of them still are not totally happy, but the growth of the church and to see their grandchildren coming back, great-grandchildren, they make concessions simply because they've seen the growth reoccur. And so very, very important. And so identifying those core values and showing your ministry, very, very important. This is C, finding commonality with the past and present core values and priorities. But then presenting your ministry as a continuation of past healthy core values. And so that's what I had to do. Well, this is strange. Well, no, it's not really strange. It's just a continuation. You know, in the African-American context, one of our greatest songwriters and hymn writers was a guy who wrote Precious Lord. His name was Thomas Dorsey, back in the early 20s and 30s. Well, Precious Lord, at the time when Dorsey wrote that song, the church frowned upon it. It was too secular. It sounded too juke joint. It sounded like a juke joint, they would say. Now it's in our hymn book. Edwin Hawkins wrote a song called "Oh Happy Day" in the 60s. The church frowned upon it. But now it's been translated in more languages than any other gospel song. The top-selling gospel singer of all times. And so to show how times change, but the core value can remain the same. Very, very important to show your ministry as a continuation of past healthy core values. The other thing, avoid the urge to be critical of their past history, although it could be warranted. Now, this is where my prayer life had to be really intensified. Because when you step into a situation, I should never forget, June of 2006, we had our youth day, our annual youth service, and the youth wanted to have gospel rap. And a gospel rap group with T-shirts, and they wanted to use the pulpit for rap. And so we made the decision to allow our youth to have a gospel rap group. Now, I don't like rap. I've never liked rap. But I had to understand that when Jesus calls us to be fishers of men, all fish don't eat the same bait. You know, a catfish will eat anything. You know, a hot dog, somebody knows what I'm talking about. A catfish will eat anything. Well, a brim has a different approach. A brim is very quick. So what you use to catch a trout, you can't use to catch a catfish. And so as Christ has called us to become fishers of men, we've got to utilize the bait that's specific to that demographic. And so using that approach. But after that service, the deacons wanted to call a meeting, special call meeting, to let me know that I had desecrated their church by allowing the youth to wear T-shirts and have gospel rap on that Sunday. It took everything I had. It took every ounce of salvation. It took every drop of blood that Christ shed on Calvary to keep me calm and to keep me poised to how to address that, because I had to understand that was their context. That's all they knew. And I had to allow them to have a sense of mourning, because what I really understood is when the church was transitioning, for them it was like a death. So much of what they knew was dying and was changing. And I had to have some sensitivity to allow them to mourn the things that they were seeing to die. And so it was bittersweet for them. And so when I wanted to be critical and say, you guys, because we didn't have praise and worship at the time, in our context, the deacons would lead the devotional service. And some of you who've never been in that experience have deacons, have gentlemen with no vocality to lead the church in worship. I think you get an understanding of what we were dealing with. It was brutal. I mean, it sounded like 20 guys getting rectal exams in worship on Sunday morning. It was an awful experience, and so trying to get them to adapt to a new approach was very, very key. But I could not become so critical and critique them negatively in a way where it would turn them away from what God was trying to do in our ministry. And so very, very important. Seek to create an environment where those who pre-existed you can be honest about needed change. This was very helpful when I finally got an opportunity for those members who pre-existed me to talk about the need for change. Very helpful. They wanted instrumentation. They wanted digital instruments in the church. They wanted praise and worship, but the leadership was very rigid and did not allow that. And so having members who wanted to see things different was very, very helpful in getting us to strategically come up with a plan to move us into a new level of ministry. The third and final thing, we must be patient during the period of adjustment. Realize there's a difference between having the title and being the leader. Just because you've been appointed or newly elected to serve as a church, I believe, and the old preachers would tell us back when I was growing up, that it takes about 5 to 7 years for that new leader to really become the pastor. You're just the preacher when you first get there. To be perfectly honest with you, some of the people who I serve now, I will never be their pastor. Their pastor was my predecessor who served for 47 years, and he's deceased now. They will allow me to preach to them, but he will always be their pastor, and I support that and I allow that because I'm not going to fight with a dead man. So I allow that, and I will love them as best I can and do all I can, but I will never be able to serve as their pastor, okay? And that's fine, okay? So I'm the only pastor that they have. and that's fine. So you have been secure enough in yourself, okay? Understanding that established ministries are more difficult to transition. Other thing, pick your battles wisely. Here's the most important thing I want to say. Focus on things, if you're going to transition, focus on things that are unbiblical, antagonistic toward growth, and repel visitors, potential members. One of the things I had to deal with was they would go to people and say, get up, this is my seat. And I have letters even now that dealt with that. So I had to deal with that because it was unbiblical. And so here's some of the few principles we utilize that helped us transition. I hope they'll be helpful to you. I'd love to discuss it further with you. But I'm just grateful for this room, grateful for the opportunity. And hopefully some things I share can be a blessing to you, to encourage you in your process. So may God bless you, may He keep you as I pray.